What remote British territory sparked a war and has more sheep than people? Hint, it's in the South Atlantic. I'm Leah, feeling curious today as always.
And I'm Garrett, ready to explore some hidden history with you.
Welcome to Laid Back Learning with Leah and Garrett.
Today, we're diving into the fascinating history and ongoing disputes of the Falkland Islands. Okay, so here's where we start. I first got hooked on the Falklands after watching a documentary about penguins and albatrosses nesting out on the outer islands. These are the smaller islands beyond the two big ones, and because a lot of them never got rats or cats, the seabird colonies just explode with life. I remember thinking, wow, this place is rugged and kind of off the beaten path, but it's also, a crossroads of history. Wildlife drew me in, but the story of how people ended up there kept me coming back. That's pretty cool, right?
Let's set the scene for this one. The Falkland Islands are a British overseas territory. That means they govern themselves on local, everyday matters. But the United Kingdom handles defense and foreign affairs. Think of the UK as a big sibling who takes the late-night phone calls if something serious happens. The archipelago sits in the South Atlantic, about 300 miles east of southern Patagonia. There are two main islands, East Falkland and West Falkland, plus hundreds of smaller ones. The capital is Stanley on East Falkland, which is where most people live and where administration happens. The climate is cool, windy, and pretty damp. Trees struggle because of the wind and the peaty soil. English is the official language, and you'll also hear accents and influences from places like St. Helena, Chile, and the Philippines because of immigration. The Falkland Islands pound is pegged 1-to-1 with the British pound sterling, so money-wise it's straightforward locally, even though Falklands notes are not legal tender back in the UK. Time-wise, they're on FKST, which is 3 hours behind UTC all year. And their motto, Desire the Right, shows up on the coat of arms and kind of sums up the community vibe.
On government, here's the simple version. The Falklands have a constitution from 2009 that sets up a devolved parliamentary system. Devolved just means powers are handed down from the UK to the local government for domestic stuff. There's a legislative assembly with elected members who serve full-time and a chief executive who runs the public service. A governor represents the monarch and, signs off on bills and chairs the executive council. London still has reserve powers to ensure good governance, and the UK takes care of defense and international relations. Also, under the British Nationality Act of 1983, islanders are British citizens with full rights, passports, the whole deal. Economically, fishing in their 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, is huge. An EEZ is the sea zone where a coastal state manages resources. Squid licenses in particular matter a lot. Tourism is growing, especially wildlife and battlefield tours, and sheep farming leans into high-quality wool. Oil exploration is out there as a possibility. It's promising for revenue, but honestly, also controversial because of environmental concerns and the ongoing dispute with Argentina.
Let's open the book on the early history. The first undisputed European landing was by John Strong, an English captain, in 1690. He sailed through the channel between the two main islands and named it Falkland Sound, after Anthony Carey, the 5th Viscount Falkland. He was a British nobleman. That name eventually spread to the whole group. Then in 1764, Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, a French explorer, set up the first European settlement at Port Louis on East Falkland and named the islands Île Malouine after Saint Malo in France. Spain soon enters the picture. In 1766, France handed its claim to Spain, and in 1767, Spain renamed that settlement Puerto Soledad. Meanwhile, in 1765, John Byron, a British naval captain, claimed the islands for Britain and founded Port Egmont on Saunders Island. Captain John McBride later reinforced that British foothold. So by the late 1760s, you had overlapping European claims. Spain and Britain both valued the islands as a strategic stopover on long voyages around South America. That tension got real in 1770 when Spain detected and then captured Port Egmont from the British garrison. A year later, in 1771, through diplomacy, the post was restored to Britain. War was avoided, but the rivalry was out in the open.
Why did France pass its claim to Spain in the first place?
Because of Bourbon family ties between the French and Spanish crowns, in simple terms, related dynasties coordinated their colonial interests, so it was a political handoff within that royal network, not a military defeat.
All right, let's roll on. Britain withdrew its small garrison in 1774 for budget and strategy reasons, but left a plaque asserting the claim for King George III. Spain continued at Puerto Soledad into the early 1800s, but by 1811, amid upheavals during the Napoleonic era, the Spanish garrison also withdrew. For a while, there was no formal government, just passing sealers, whalers, and some gauchos, who are South American horsemen and cattle herders. In 1820, David Jewett, an American-born privateer acting for the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, which is an early Argentine state, proclaimed a claim in the islands to ships anchored there. Then Buenos Aires granted Luis Vernet, a German-born merchant, rights to exploit feral cattle. Vernet settled at the old Spanish site in 1826, built things up, and by 1829, Buenos Aires appointed him as military and civil commander. He tried to regulate sealing, which upset foreign ships. In 1831, the USS Lexington, under Commander Silas Duncan of the U.S. Navy, raided Vernet's settlement after disputes at sea. The extent of damage is debated, but the local administration was effectively broken.
Then in late 1832, Buenos Aires sent a small garrison, which mutinied within weeks. In January 1833, British forces arrived and reasserted British rule. That's a major hinge point. Argentina has long viewed that as an illegal usurpation, while Britain frames it as reoccupation tied to earlier claims. The narrative split there. Afterward, settlers continued, and in 1833, a dramatic event unfolded when Antonio Rivero, a gaucho, led a group that killed Matthew Brisbane, Vernet's deputy, and others. Survivors hid until British forces restored order. It showed how fragile life on the islands could be in that era. By 1840, the islands were made a British crown colony, and in 1845, Stanley became the seat of government. Over the 19th century, the economy shifted. Early on, there was a famous wrecking trade, basically salvaging and selling damaged ships and cargo from tough Cape Horn voyages. After 1851, when the Falkland Islands Company bought Samuel Lafone's enterprise and brought in Cheviot sheep, wool began to dominate. That move from feral cattle to fine wool sheep created steadier, land-based livelihoods. Over time, as steamships replaced sail and the Panama Canal opened in 1914, the ship repair niche faded, but the pastoral economy held on.
20th century flashpoints pop up too. In 1908, Britain set up the Falkland Islands dependencies to administer subantarctic and Antarctic claims from the Falklands. In December 1914, the Royal Navy fought the Battle of the Falkland Islands, defeating a German squadron. If you've seen William Lionel Wiley's maritime paintings, that era features heavily. Later, during World War II, ships like HMS Exeter came to Stanley for repairs after the Battle of the River Plate. Fast forward to the UN era. In 1965, the General Assembly passed Resolution 2065, calling for the UK and Argentina to negotiate over the sovereignty dispute. That's also when the UN settled on the dual naming convention in its documents, Falkland Islands, and in Spanish, Islas Malvinas. Talks between the UK and Argentina in the late 1960s even considered a possible sovereignty transfer, but islander opposition and politics on both sides stalled things. In the 1970s, there were practical cooperation steps like a travel and trade agreement, and Argentina helped build a temporary airfield at Stanley. Lord Shackleton, a British peer, wrote reports in 1976 and again in 1982 recommending economic diversification, including fisheries, oil exploration, and tourism, plus better roads and land reform. Some of those ideas really blossomed after the conflict that came next.
In 1982, Argentina invaded the islands in April, and after a 10-week conflict, British forces retook them in June. The war reshaped everything. The UK built RAF Mount Pleasant, a major base that improved air links and deterrence, and the local economy later diversified in line with those Shackleton recommendations. In 1983, islanders became British citizens under a Special Nationality Act. Over time, the islands also professionalized their politics, and in 2009, a new constitution set out full internal self-government, while the UK kept defence and foreign affairs. A few more modern milestones stand out. In 2013, a referendum saw a 99.8% vote to remain a British overseas territory. During the 2010s, there was oil exploration interest, with debate about environment and jurisdiction. And a long-running issue, landmines from 1982, came to a close in October 2020 when demining finished. Demining means removing mines and unexploded ordnance, and it took decades in those peaty soils. That let residents safely reclaim beaches and pastures. Today, you've got a small population, just over 3,500 in 2021, a lot of wildlife tourism, and a high per-person GDP, because fisheries revenue is spread over a small number of people.
Current governance notes are interesting too. In 2024, Stephen Doughty is the UK minister with responsibility for the Falklands. That's within the UK's Foreign Office team. In 2025, Colin Martin Reynolds took over as governor, the monarch's representative, and Andrea Clausen became chief executive, the top civil service role. She's the first woman and first Falkland Islander in that post. Those roles matter for how local policy gets implemented and how the UK connection works day to day. Shifting from modern politics to contested history, so lasting controversies. One big question is who first discovered the islands. Records from the 1500s are murky. A bunch of European voyages reported landfalls in the South Atlantic, but it's unclear whether they meant the Falklands or somewhere else. John Strong's 1690 landing is the first undisputed one in the standard histories. He left a name and a clear account. I'd argue that matters a lot historically because certainty anchors later claims and navigation. If you can pin down the first solid landing and naming, that's a reference point everyone can agree on, even if earlier mentions exist in a fog of old maps and vague logs.
I hear you, but I want to ask why earlier mentions get discounted. If explorers in the 1500s or 1600s wrote about islands in those latitudes, even if they mixed up features, doesn't that still count for something? Old charts were full of approximations. When we say undisputed, we're really saying the documentation clears the modern bar of evidence. But sovereignty debates sometimes pull in these fuzzy first sighting claims anyway. Argentina emphasizes inheritance from Spain in 1816. Britain emphasizes continuous administration since 1833 and the islanders' self-determination, which is the idea that people get to choose their political status. So the discovery angle feels like one thread in a bigger legal tapestry.
Totally fair. And that intersects with another principle, territorial integrity, which is a state's interest in maintaining its borders. At the UN, those two ideas, self-determination and territorial integrity, sometimes pull in different directions. Resolution 2065 asked the UK and Argentina to talk without saying who is right. Even the UN's dual name, Falkland Islands in English and Islas Malvinas in Spanish, captures that neutrality. So yeah, early sightings are part of the story, but modern arguments hinge more on what happened after 1833 and on what the current residents want, alongside international law.
Real talk, I think it's okay to hold two ideas at once. The historical record can be ambiguous, and at the same time, people living there today have clear views, shown in that 2013 referendum. It's a complex, long-running dispute, and it keeps diplomacy busy. What's the buzz for me is that amid that complexity, daily life goes on. Kids go to school in Stanley, ferries cross Falkland Sound, and biologists tag penguins on those predator-free outer islands.
Speaking of culture, the territory uses God Save the King by custom as the national anthem, and there's a local territorial anthem called Song of the Falklands. If a filmmaker wanted a soundtrack that blends wind, waves, and memory, that song would be a perfect closing credit piece. I could also see a doc-series that pairs the sites of albatross colonies with interviews about land reform, fisheries science, and the legacy of demeaning, by the way, is the painstaking work of locating and removing landmines. That contrast between wild beauty and careful governance has a lot of storytelling power.
All right, on to the next. What if the 1960s talks had actually transferred sovereignty to Argentina? Let's unpack this. If London and Buenos Aires had agreed terms and the islanders had gone along at the time, the islands might have become an Argentine-administered territory with guarantees for local culture, language, and law. Maybe bilingual signs in Stanley, Porto Stanley in Spanish usage, and some special economic zone status to keep trade steady. The UK probably wouldn't have built RAF Mount Pleasant in the 1980s. That's the big base outside Stanley now. Without that base, tourism growth might have been slower, or it might have hinged more on links to South American hubs.
I'm down for that thought experiment. If sovereignty shifted peacefully in the late 1960s, the 1982 war likely wouldn't have happened, avoiding loss of life on both sides. Fisheries would still be central, but the EEZ lines would have been drawn from Argentine sovereignty, which could change how licensing, enforcement, and revenue sharing worked. Oil exploration politics might be less tense domestically, though global markets still rule. Culturally, I could see an island identity that remains distinctly Falklands, just nested in Argentine frameworks, kind of like how some regions keep strong local traditions inside a larger national system.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Would the islands still feel as English-speaking as they do now? Probably yes, but with more Spanish language in schools and services. And what about legal protections? The current system is tied to English law and European Convention on Human Rights principles through the Constitution, with appeals to UK institutions. Under Argentine administration, you'd shift to Argentine legal pathways. That's not a value judgment, just a change in legal architecture. Economically, high per capita GDP might look different if revenue flows and subsidies took other routes. That's something to chew on, huh?
And on memory and monuments, the battlefields would still exist, but the story told at memorials would shift from liberation and reassertion to maybe a narrative of peaceful transfer and regional integration. Different plaques, same windswept ridgelines. Either way, the place's stark beauty would pull people in. Yeah, that checks out.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
Stay curious and see you next time on Laid Back Learning with Leah and Garrett.